Good afternoon. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us, our Basel Miami Beach Conversations. This conversation is related to the one prior, which was more the museum perspective. This is a collector talk called Changing Times, Changing Collections. And I'm very grateful and excited to introduce our moderator, Josh Baer, who's an advisor and publisher of the Baer Faxt in New York. And please join us, yay, in welcoming all the speakers. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Everybody can hear us with these handheld mics. My role is often about talking about the art market, as I do that in a newsletter, and I'm an art advisor that helps people buy stuff like that, some of that expensive stuff that's over there. Today we're joined by two very distinguished collectors who've been involved in collecting art for decades. And I'd like to ask them to say a word or two about who they are and what they do, and then we'll get into it pretty quickly.
Great. Thanks, Josh. It's nice to be here. Thanks, Art Basel. My name is Bridget Evans. I'm a collector from Boston. I've been collecting for about 20 years. And I'm also the co-founder and president of Via Art Fund, which is a collective initiative of individuals and family foundations from around the country. We pool our resources and write grants on behalf of artists, curators, and organizations around the world. And I'm also a trustee of the Institute of Contemporary Art Boston. So I know our topic might wander into all three of those roles today.
Enjoy being here. My name is John Hoffman. I'm from Kansas City. My wife and I have been collecting for 49 years. And yes, we have changed our collection. We started with pop art. And actually before that, we were influenced by Thomas Hart Benton, a regional muralist who was Jackson Pollock's early teachers. And I remember my parents saying, "You don't have to collect what we collect." And over the years, our collection has changed quite a bit from pop art to now we concentrate on African American and African art. And we've been involved in Four Freedoms, which is an art super PAC that was started 3 years ago in our living room by Hank Willis Thomas and Eric Gottsman, and is now on with 140 artists on 80 campuses, and we hope is making a difference in the way we look at our political system and our democracy that we fight for every day.
Before we get into it, I find it helps to understand our audience. So if you're an artist, could you raise your hand? Okay, if you're a gallerist or art dealer, raise your hand. Okay, that's 8-3. Okay, journalist, critic, curator, somebody who came because they heard it was free and thought it was a good way to get out of the sun. So we have a little bit of a mix here. It helps to try to address our answers. So I think all of us on the stage have been involved 20, 30, 40, 50 years with the market, but in particular collecting art made by women and art made by African Americans. It's like, what do you think that suddenly all the museums and the institutions woke up about 20 minutes ago and said, whoops, why haven't we been doing this? I mean, it seems like they just awoke out of a deep slumber like yesterday. Do you see it that way?
Well, yeah, for sure. I mean, I have to say that the study that was conducted by, I think it was Sotheby's and ArtNet, right? That looked at the acquisitions by museums over the last 10 years. I think African American artists accounted for 2% of the acquisitions and about 7 or 8% of the exhibitions. So, of course, I think there is kind of an awakening to the fact that maybe our museums aren't so representative.
I think museums basically are behind the 8 ball. They are encyclopedic in many cases, unless it's only a contemporary museum or gallery. And I think that most of the staff are professionals. They're not collectors, and therefore they look backwards instead of forwards. And it's hard for a museum to send people all over the world, their staff, their curators, looking for new art, new young art. So they pay more attention to what the trends coming out of the major art market centers are doing. In fact, in Kansas City, they come over and ask us what's going on. So hopefully they'll catch up.
Are they being shamed into catching up, do you think? Or are they legitimately, I'm talking about the museums now, I'll get to the galleries in a second, saying, oops, or that it's suddenly interesting, or how did it just, the light bulb go off?
Well, with the internet, of course, they can see what's going on. They may not react to it as quickly as a collector, but they can see the trends developing, and they can look at the auction market, they can look at the fairs, and occasionally they do get sent to a fair or two. But generally, they're looking backwards because it takes time to put an exhibit together, and so they're busy doing their job, being curators.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's completely heartfelt. I mean, even in our own collections, I think what we are collecting is changing. And what is so compelling right now is really much of the art that's coming out of African American artists. And I forget where I read this, but I thought it was so interesting. There was an article about Kerry James Marshall and why now is the time where his art was appreciated, whereas 10, 20 years ago, curators were not appreciating it the same. And the comment was made that this kind of figurative work, kind of everyday landscape or vignette of individuals that Kerry was painting just didn't resonate because at the time, curators didn't understand that there was actually a narration under all of that. And I think we've awoken to that now, and we really appreciate what is being said in those paintings.
I think if you go to the Rebel collection now, you can see there's another generation. I was going to talk about the market, but you moved into the art itself of saying, what's my experience? And in a narrative kind of way of shopping in the bodega, living in the neighborhood, that there's a more personal experience that's sort of the moment that we're seeing in art making. Do you see, you were saying that this is sort of a historical move and a critical move into work by African Americans at the moment. Do you see that?
I really don't see that. I think the museum that area of art is late to the table, but they were looking at things, but from 60, 70 years ago.
What about the galleries? Have they come to this as a upstanding and moral way, you think, as the institutions?
Well, galleries, try to create a market for new buyers, new collectors, and so they're always looking for the new things. If you're in that level, I mean, if you've moved on to the big leagues where you're only dealing with blue chips, I think you stay with your artists that have been loyal to you and you've been to them, and you don't change much. But interesting story, Nick Cave. Everybody know who Nick Cave is? So 10 years ago, the Nelson Gallery built a new wing to the museum. And they were thinking, what should we do for the opening? And we really want to make a splash. And Sharon and I went to them and said, there's an artist that went to the Kansas City Art Institute, in Cranbrook, and he's in Chicago. He's becoming a fairly big name. His name is Nick Cave. I said, who? I said, no, Nick Cave, he really, I mean, yes, he's hometown, but he's making a name for himself. And I said, in addition, he has these sound suits that he can do dances. It would be great to inaugurate this new beautiful building with his sound suits. They said, no way, this isn't, we've got to do something a little less risky. So there's the story of the museum looking backwards.
Right. The galleries, I get all these press releases now saying, we now represent African-American artist so-and-so, or Caribbean artist so-and-so. I don't get any that says, we now represent white male artist so-and-so. So I feel maybe a little disingenuous, the gallery system now coming into it. Occasionally, not everybody. I think when Jack Shaman signed Nick Cave, he didn't say, I now represent, he just said, I represent Nick Cave. Yeah. And now they wouldn't. I've interrupted you in a sense.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I'll be the non-jaded person on the panel, and
I'm a New Yorker, sorry.
I mean, I just take my own collecting. I started off as very much an abstract painter collector and followed that narrative for many years. And I think, you know, at some point, kind of the door was opened for me to really think beyond the physical beauty of the painting or the attributes of the painting and start thinking about the concepts and the ideas behind it and what was, you know, kind of the social inquiry. And it's really compelling right now. And I think it's a convergence of, yes, it's the collectors, it's the galleries, it's the curators, and putting the knowledge out there about these artists and what their work represents. And so I don't see it as, you know, something that people are being forced to do or it's politically correct to do. At least one person, it's just really compelling art.
And John, the reason in terms of the art that you started collecting art by women and African Americans, the content there spoke to you, right? It wasn't that you were, it was that, and was it also more available, lower priced, less collected, that you were able to buy better things because there were fewer people pursuing that? I mean, when I had my gallery, I represented a lot of important women artists, and a lot of the galleries didn't want to. So it was an opportunity as well as what the work was about. Do you find that for both of you?
As far as gender is concerned, I've never looked at a work of art knowing that it's a male or female artist. That to me is not the important thing. It's what is being said in the work of art. And it just happens that along the way, my wife and I were very invested in the urban core. And we lived urban. When everybody else moved to the suburbs, we stayed. We helped found the Kansas City Friends of Alvin Ailey. And my wife was involved in Planned Parenthood. So, and we were involved in the religious issues of the time. But how we really got to collecting was through a man by the name of Ted Coe, who was the curator of contemporary art at the time in 1970. He went on to be the director and then retired about 10 years later. But he brought us under his wing and he said, you know, 3 years ago I brought pop artists to Kansas City. And there were 15 of them. And they were all the names that you recognize today. And they were all for sale. And I really went out on a limb because I told Leo Castelli and Ivan Karp that we had collectors in Kansas City. One piece was sold to a Kansas Citian. He said, I was so embarrassed I bought two myself and I sent them back. They were between $1,000 and $2,500 a piece. Those same pieces today are the iconic early pop artists from the late 60s. He said, that's not going to happen again. I'm going to teach you all how to collect. And he put together a group of us, of young collectors, and helped us begin to learn how to look and how to analyze what the artist was saying. Now, as far as we got to the African-American artists a little later in the late 80s, because that's the art that was speaking to us. Kerry James Marshall and Nick Cave and Kehinde Wiley, they all resonated with who we were and what our lives were all about. You know, I had been a Peace Corps volunteer, but that just gave me the basis for understanding there's a third world out there. And there are people that don't have all the things that we have. And so that became the nucleus of our collection, was what we believed in and what spoke to us.
Richard was conscious the directions your collection went, or was it
Absolutely not. Yeah.
accidental, or was what?
I still have never bought a piece of art because I'm trying to build a collection of women or trying to build a collection of African American or Latino artists. I just don't think that way. But I think that, if you look at some of the more recent acquisitions and some of the artists that I'm very intrigued by today, you see there are people like Simone Lee and Kevin Beasley and continued Glenn Ligon. He's not exactly a relatively new artist, but yeah, I just think,
Well, what's interesting going on is that this $20+ million Kerry James Marshall painting that was sold at Sotheby's that P. Diddy bought got a lot of attention. But what's really interesting is that now black, wealthy Americans are saying, wait a second, I need to collect my own culture that speaks to me. And the resurgence in the market of women artists is by women having the purse strings and say, wait a second, I'm supporting not in the old-fashioned sort of regional way where I only bought art from France or Germany. And I think that's a good thing that people are saying, wait a second, these are issues where the work itself is involved with those issues, that people are saying, I can relate, I need to support that, I see it in myself. Wouldn't you say that that's the good side of what's happened within that?
I mean, for example, at Via Art Fund, one of the grants we wrote, I don't know if it's a year or two ago now, was to the Dia Foundation for, I think it'll open in the spring, but a major installation of Charlotte Posenenska, a minimalist sculptor from the 1970s, kind of the era of Donald Judd and Sarah, et cetera. She was completely overlooked. And of course, now it's doubly exciting to go back and look at her work and think about giving her her due. It has nothing to do with it was like less expensive or, it's just an exciting chance to be a revisionist and make good on that.
It's interesting, the last talk, was anybody here at the last talk with the museum directors? Okay, well, the same point goes. There were like 4 white people there talking about diversity in institutions. And once again, here we have 3 white people talking about that in front of a convention center with maybe 2 black gallery owners. And it's like, we should pay attention to what's also going on within the way that we're trying to talk about the changing of these.
Well, trends change, life changes. Artists are representing what they see in front of them. And I think, beforehand we were talking about, I can't get very excited about landscapes anymore. They don't speak to me. I can see a landscape every evening and a sunset. So it has to have something more to it, and it has to resonate. And my wife and I have always bought emotionally, things that really speak to us. So when you think of why you're buying, it's never been financially motivated. And yes, you see things going on at auctions, and the prices are crazy. But for the younger investor in art, the younger collector, you have to put your foot in the water somewhere. And there's 20-odd fairs going on at Art Basel Miami, and you could get really bogged down and on overload very quickly, seeing so much in such a short period of time. So to focus is hard today. It used to be, you look at pop art or you looked at more pop art. Today, it's really varied, and so it becomes such an important part of our lives because visuals have become such an important part of our lives. And it used to be you couldn't really access what was going on around the world. Today, through the internet, you can, any artist you want to learn more about, you can get the whole story in less than 5 minutes. So it's a matter of focusing. And young collectors or new collectors come to us and say, I am confused. How do I step in? How do I know where to start? And so that's why we have tried to focus and be more selective. Male, female doesn't matter. White, black doesn't really matter. It's what is being said on the canvas, on the sculpture, in the video. We collect it all, and we're running out of space. That's another big problem. How do you deal with the fact that you have a voracious appetite as a collector?
You were talking about not being interested in landscape paintings per se and what's going on around us. Do you find or that you're surprised, or I will say I find that I'm surprised, and see if you agree or disagree, that many or most artists are in this politically charged moment of the last few years are not taking on those issues very much? You walk out there and you'll see a lot of decorative, art about art, historically based things, but very little work that really aggressively addresses the climate that we're in most of the time.
Well, I think it's interesting to think about Hank Willis Thomas, and I think a lot of the art that I've been attracted to or drawn to, there was a underlying social inquiry. It might have been subtle, but it was there, and it was an inquiry of the artist coming through the work. I think with something like Hank Willis Thomas for Freedom Project, along with Eric Gotzman, and I didn't know it was founded in your living room, and Via Art Fund actually wrote a grant for Four Freedoms for a town series, which I could talk about more, but that's really different, what Hank is doing, that kind of social activism or whatever you want to call it. That's very different than what's going on in the halls here. Or you see an artist
What
like...
would you say about Sam Gilliam having this renaissance now? How many people here know Sam Gilliam's work? Okay, so nearly 50 years of abstract making art in Washington, some success, 45 years of being forgotten, even in his hometown. Suddenly, $1 million prices coming in and being seen. And he wrote on the wall of his exhibition in Switzerland, basically, I'm an abstract artist, I'm not a black artist. But the market has said, wait a second, here we go at Clark's and Gilliam. It's like, again, something's going on here that's sort of not as...
Yeah, well, I think,
He's a good artist.
Yeah, once you see that there's some traction in a certain field of contemporary art, everybody wants to be, on the front page. They don't want to be somewhere else. They want to be where the action is. So when P. Diddy steps up with $21 million, I mean, people notice something like that. But not everybody is in that category of being able to buy that pricey art. So what's the next step? Who is this Kerry James Marshall person? And then once you figure it out, I think you're drawn to the field of African American or African just because there's so much publicity on it. And there's a lot more going on out there. But as I said, you can't be everywhere. You can't be all things to all people. So you have to decide as a young collector or even as an experienced collector, you only have a certain amount of wall space. You only have a certain amount in your budget. So where do you put your foot in the water, and how can it make a difference in your life? We've never bought art because of that someday it may be worth something more than it is today. People come to me and they said, how did you know 15 years ago when you bought your Kerry James Marshall or your Candy Wiley? And I said, well, we didn't know. I mean, we didn't know anything other than it spoke to us. And the emotional value of it is much more important to us than the financial value. Now, you come to collecting, we have 5 different locations where we have art. Our kids are art collectors now, and we have several homes. But again, if you're a voracious collector, it's hard to stop, as you know. So you wind up with a lot of art. So we're at a point at age 78. What do we do with it all now that we've enjoyed it all these years? So we've started gifting it to museums. And we had one stipulation. We gave our Candy Wiley to the Nelson Gallery. One stipulation. You must start a collector's council. Well, why do we need that? They said, and I said, that's how we learned how to collect. And if you want to go out and pay $21 million for a great painting, where are you going to get it? You're going to get it from your patrons, from your board, from collectors, and they need to know what all this hubbub is all about. So you need to start this collectors council and teach people how to look at art, how to collect, and someday, two things may happen. They will believe that you're worthy of a donation, or you're worthy of taking one of the paintings in your collection and gifting it. And that's what we did.
Bridget, I just want to come back to the point I made about Black abstract art. Does that resonate to you, or does it matter to you? Is that another misnomer to reward those artists based on that rather than just purely as abstractionists?
Well, that's interesting. I think the fact that Pamela Joyner and some of the museum directors and curators in the country have created the education around Black abstract artists, I think is helpful. It helps us to learn about it. It helps us to know it. It puts it on the stage and out front. And so I appreciate that because I didn't know who Jack Whitten was 5 years ago. And yet, do I think that they need to go down in art history as having belonged to the Black abstract painters? I would say absolutely not. And yes, there's increased emphasis now on diversity and inclusion. It's just not Black. And I think museums, yes, there's a lot of activity around this, but also, just kind of circling back to the previous talk here, it's also because museums want to be more of the community. They want to bring new people into the museum. And so the museums need to be reflective of society.
Well, and for me, the artists that I've been interested in, it's the part of African American that's the most interesting is the American part. So as somebody who grew up through the civil rights movement, all those things resonate to me in a way that the Black European artists who are dealing largely with colonialism don't resonate to me. But they're still Black, and they still have Black experiences, but it's a different kind of thing. So being interested in buying and selling, mostly buying David Hammons and Ligon and Basquiat and yada, yada, yada for 30 years and working with those artists, it's an American phenomenon that I was most interested in, which makes me ask one last question before we have the open up for questions. To what extent are white artists allowed to get involved in this discussion? I'm reminded of the Dana Schutz issue, the last Whitney Biennial, where she was told she was not allowed to legitimately paint Black people because she was not Black.
Well, hopefully that's more isolated. I think collectors and museums and galleries are more sophisticated than that. But, you're going to have that criticism. I mean, when Ophelia showed his work with the cow dung and, everybody was in a big uproar, or the Piss Christ, those are controversial items. But
Ophelia was controversial because he made the Virgin Mary Black. And that's why they objected to it. Not that it was elephant dung.
Yeah.
It was.
Well, you can take it many ways, but the conversation is what's most important. If you can get the community and get it larger and larger so that a museum actually becomes an extension of your own home, then you get people that wouldn't step over the threshold because they were afraid to not know what was going on. As Michelle Obama said, I would walk into a museum and nobody looked like me. Well, today, we gifted our Kennedy Wiley to the Nelson. People come in, and you know what the first thing they ask for? Where's the Barack Obama painting? So there you see the influence that visual art has on everybody, whether you're inexperienced or young or old or black or white. It's a conversation that is now being told in museums that understand that the museum's for everybody, not for the elite.
So let's try for some questions in the time that we have. So I believe we have a microphone there. If you could raise your hand, and if you don't mind saying that you're an artist or a dealer or what have you. So do we have any questions? There's microphones over there. Really? We were either so uninteresting or so brilliant that we left you speechless. We have one up here. Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess I'm asking as a collector. And let's see. So to Bridget, because you were talking about you were collecting abstract art, and then you mentioned a lot of names that I don't know. So you said your collecting had changed. So is that still abstract art, or what? Or more specifically, what was the change?
Yeah, what I was referring to is I came to collecting from a fairly uneducated basis. So never took a liberal arts class in my life. I was finance undergrad, and I have a business school graduate degree. And never went to a museum until from a small town in Ohio, never went to a museum until I graduated college. So for me, what attracted me first to collecting art was really physical beauty, just falling in love with paintings. And I think that what I gravitated towards, I first started collecting figurative artists like Alice Neal. And so I think I was onto something there, and then moved into kind of more abstract, but it was really a Glenn Ligon painting from the Stranger series that when I saw that work and I understood what was behind the making of it, it opened a door for me. Really, truly just opened my heart and mind to the possibility of art. And I think anytime a person's a collector, it's really a self-journey. I mean, it's this very incredibly, in the most positive way, an ego-driven, yeah. And you're being challenged, and your mind and heart are being opened. And so this is a very long-winded answer to your question. And so today, I've continued to buy abstract art, but I do think that a Kerry James Marshall that's very different from abstract art is incredibly powerful for me today. Unfortunately, I don't own any. But I also, Simone Lee is a ceramicist, and she's very much about the female body just actually as the object and the audience for her work. And so I think I've expanded my horizons beyond just painting, or even I actually own a Rare Crit cooking installation, which is the craziest thing a collector could ever buy. So that's really what I was alluding to.
Another question.
Yeah. Good afternoon. My name is Louis. I'm a collector, and as well as wearing other hats in the art world. And I wanted to ask you, how do you balance the narrative versus the aesthetic? Because I hear your comments around the Glenn Ligon opening a door for you. And is it possible for that door to be opened without hearing the story? And is the work still as compelling without knowing the story?
Well, we collect some abstract, but really the narrative to us is the most compelling reason we buy art that we buy. And I would have to say, you have to decide on your own which is most important. But I find a lot of people come through our home that are visiting Kansas City on their way to Crystal Bridges or to the Nelson Gallery, and they all want to hear the stories. So it's kind of hard to tell the story of Ellsworth Kelly. And it's kind of hard to tell the story of Rothko, but it's very easy to talk about Titus Kaphar and how he juxtaposes James Madison with a slave. And the same-
Certainly with Glenlyon, if you know that the writing is from Baldwin, Stranger in a Village, about being the only black person in Switzerland in the 40s or 50s, it enhances your appreciation of that work, but still physically and aesthetically it's the same work, whether you know that or not.
And I think it's that marriage, right, of the idea with the making of a incredibly, I'll use the word beautiful, but that's too narrow of a word, object. And so for example, for Glenn's work, I saw it first. I was like, what is that? And that coal dust and that white and the stencil and the black, and then you learn. So the genius, I think, of, the most important artists of our time will be the ones that have that idea or the narrative and are able to turn that into an incredibly compelling visual and physical object.
One quick story. Early in our collecting career, we went to the West Coast and to Coronado Del Mar, and the exhibit going on at the gallery was Gem Dine. And it was gorgeous, hearts all over the place. And we bought a beautiful heart in a green meadow. And it was large, it was about 8 feet square. We got it home, hung it, and we lived with it for 8 years. And one day I said to my wife, how do you feel about this Gem Dine red heart in my green meadow? She said, well, I'm kind of getting tired of it. I said, well, it's a big wall. Maybe we could exchange it for something else. We had paid $8,000 for it. We called a dealer and said, what's it worth? We've never sold a piece. He said, well, we'll test the market. This was 1979, 1980. Came back and he said, we can get you $50,000. I said, sold. We have never looked back. We don't miss the piece. We had 8 or 9 years of it. We enjoyed it, but it didn't wear past that time. That happens with collectors. And you also get to a point where you've enjoyed a piece, let somebody else enjoy it. We're looking to possibly sell our Kerry James Marshall that happens to have both Kennedys and Martin Luther King in the imagery. It's gorgeous. We love it. We've lived with for almost 20 years. Why not allow either a museum or another collector to enjoy it the way we have, and gives us some wall space and maybe a few bucks in our pocket to go out and look at new, young, emerging artists.
Can I ask a question? Do you think there's more content in contemporary art of the here and now than there was when, you said 49 years you've been collecting? Or was there just as much content in pop art and it's just not resonating as much with us right now?
Well, we all grow. I'm not 30 years old anymore. And so our times change, the world changes, and you see new, young, emerging artists that are so exciting that you really want to be in that area of collecting. They're new, you get to meet them, you get to have conversations, and all of a sudden, that's what you want to have on your walls. So if you've lived with a wonderful piece of art, even a Kerry James Marshall, even a Van Gogh, maybe it's time to go. The Impressionists never sold a work of art in their lifetimes.
It's a bit, to come back to your question a little bit, on the one hand, it's a bit of an elitist activity of looking at art and collecting art and experiencing art. I recently was at a wedding and I sat next to a French guy and I was trying to explain, my wife tried to get me to explain how I'd sold 2 light bulbs by Felix Gonzalez Torres and for like whatever amount of money and why that was art. I said, well, it's pretty hard to explain to an outsider about what the content would be, like me trying, to explain nuclear physics to somebody who was a stranger, and the guy looked at me and says, well, I'm a nuclear physicist. It's funny you say that. So the language of looking changes to different levels of education, experience, and all that. So I think there's content in a Rothko. So the notion of what content can be varies, and we have a we've sort of dumbed down the view of what content means. And it can be a much more academic or intellectual or elitist conversation as well occasionally.
So speaking of Rothko, on our trip to Mexico one year, we made a special stop to see the Rothko Chapel. And it was one of the most moving experiences of my lifetime. So, abstract, narrative, it all depends on who you are and what's in here.
Do we have time for one more question? Up front.
Hi, my name is Masha. I'm from Copenhagen, and we have an art foundation. And my question is, we are talking now about African American artists and some American artists and female artists. But if we look at the broader world, would you feel the same emotional response to a Chinese artist or an Indian artist or a Polish artist? Do you feel that you're open to that, or are you still focusing in some way?
No, I definitely am, but it's also a question of education and learning, and that's why a little bit I get back to where if we have a saturated moment with African American artists, if you will, I think it's all about us understanding. So we need more exposure, we need more understanding, we need more education about artists around the world. But my current collection is not just American artists.
For me, it's interesting if it's got something global and universal in the art. So 99.9% of the art I've seen from China doesn't. Now, it doesn't make it bad. It just means I don't have the cultural knowledge and background or time to get that to understand all those references. But when I see Ai Weiwei, his work speaks to me in a way that speaks to all of us. So for me, it becomes interesting there. It's not better or worse. That's a choice I've made for the amount of time and energy I have to learn.
I would say it's up to the individual and the exposure. And yes, we're on Instagram and the internet, and we can see worldwide trends in art. Again, you can't collect everything. We happen to have Chinese in our collection, and we have South African and African in our collection. But we like to focus on something that we can say we have curators that come over, and we have one that helps us a lot. And she's helped us put the art in a way, as she says, it speaks to each other. So it's a little hard for a work by a Chinese artist to speak to an African American artist. There are some similar topics, and we have a lot of that, and you can compare and contrast. But again, from a professional point of view, the curator says, this art, to really resonate, needs to have conversations with each other. And so we follow a professional's advice.
Thank you both. Thank you to everybody for coming. If you want to say hi, stop by and say hi to us. Thank you, Bridget and John.
Thanks, Josh.